The morning mist clung to the forest floor like a ghostly shroud as Elena Petrov adjusted the worn leather strap of her hunting rifle. At 23, she had already earned a reputation among the villagers of Karelia as the finest marksman in 3 counties. Her father, a veteran of the Great War, had taught her to shoot when she was barely tall enough to hold a rifle steady. Now, as the sound of distant artillery echoed through the pine trees, those childhood lessons would prove more valuable than anyone could have imagined. The year was 1941, and the world had erupted into chaos. Hitler's war machine had swept across Europe with terrifying efficiency, and now the Wehrmacht stood at the gates of the Soviet Union. In the small villages scattered across the Russian frontier, ordinary people found themselves thrust into extraordinary circumstances. Elena was no exception. She lived in a modest wooden house on the outskirts of Petrozavodsk with her younger brother Mikhail and their aging grandmother. Their parents had died in a factory accident 3 years earlier, leaving Elena to shoulder responsibilities far beyond her years. She worked as a seamstress in the local textile mill during the day and supplemented their meager income by hunting game in the vast forests that surrounded their village. Elena possessed an unusual combination of patience and precision that made her exceptional with a rifle. She could remain motionless for hours, waiting for the perfect shot. Her neighbors often joked that she could put a bullet through a squirrel's eye at 200 meters without disturbing the creature's whiskers. What they didn't realize was that this skill would soon make her one of the most feared snipers on the Eastern Front. The invasion began on June 22, 1941. Elena was returning from an early morning hunt when she heard the first bombers overhead. The Luftwaffe's Stukas screamed across the dawn sky like mechanical vultures, their distinctive whining engines striking terror into anyone who heard them. Within hours, the peaceful rural landscape had transformed into a battlefield. Refugees began streaming through the village, carrying whatever possessions they could manage. They brought stories of German brutality that seemed almost too horrible to believe. Entire villages burned to the ground, civilians executed without mercy, children separated from their families forever. Elena listened to these accounts with growing anger and determination. The local military commander, Colonel Dmitry Volkov, established a temporary headquarters in the village school. A grizzled veteran with steel-gray eyes and a permanent limp from the Finnish War, Volkov quickly organized the civilian population into defensive positions. He knew that regular army units were retreating rapidly before the German advance, leaving scattered pockets of resistance to slow the enemy's progress. Elena first encountered Colonel Volkov when she brought him a deer she had shot to help feed the growing number of soldiers and refugees in the village. The colonel was impressed not just by her generosity, but by the precision of her shot. The deer had been killed with a single bullet through the heart at what Elena casually mentioned was about 300 meters. "That's remarkable shooting, young woman," Volkov said, examining the carcass. "Where did you learn to handle a rifle like that?" Elena shrugged modestly. "My father taught me when I was small. He said a person should be able to provide for their family, no matter what happens." The colonel studied her carefully. Elena was not conventionally beautiful, but she possessed a quiet intensity that commanded respect. Her dark hair was usually pulled back in a practical bun, and her clothes were simple and functional. Most striking were her eyes, pale blue and utterly calm, even in the chaos surrounding the village. Over the following days, as German forces drew closer, Volkov found himself increasingly impressed by Elena's composure under pressure. While other civilians panicked or fled, she remained steady and helpful. She organized the other women to prepare food and medical supplies, helped dig defensive positions, and continued hunting to supplement their dwindling food stores. The first German patrol arrived on a gray Tuesday morning in early July. Elena was in the forest when she heard the distinctive sound of German engines approaching the village. She crept to the edge of the tree line and watched through her rifle scope as a motorcycle with sidecar rolled down the main street, followed by a small truck carrying about a dozen soldiers. The Germans moved with casual confidence, clearly not expecting serious resistance from what appeared to be a nearly abandoned village. They began searching houses methodically, looking for weapons, supplies, and any sign of Soviet military presence. Elena watched as they roughly questioned an elderly man who couldn't flee with the others. When he couldn't understand their broken Russian, one soldier struck him with a rifle butt. Something cold and hard crystallized in Elena's chest as she witnessed this casual cruelty. She had heard the stories from refugees, but seeing German brutality firsthand was different. These weren't the honorable soldiers her father had sometimes described from his war stories. These were men who struck helpless old people and burned homes for sport. She adjusted her scope and settled into a comfortable shooting position. The motorcycle driver was about 250 meters away, well within her range. Elena controlled her breathing, let her heart rate slow, and gently squeezed the trigger. The shot echoed across the village like thunder. The German soldier toppled from his motorcycle, killed instantly by a bullet through the head. For a moment, his companions stood frozen in confusion, unable to determine where the shot had come from. Elena was already moving, slipping deeper into the forest before they could react. The remaining Germans immediately took defensive positions and began firing randomly into the tree line. Their shots went wild, hitting nothing but bark and leaves. After several minutes of frantic shooting, they loaded their dead comrade into the truck and retreated rapidly toward their main force. Colonel Volkov found Elena an hour later, cleaning her rifle in the woods behind her house. He said nothing at first, simply sat on a fallen log and watched her work. Elena's hands were steady as she ran the cleaning rod through the barrel, showing no sign of the trauma that might affect someone who had just killed another human being for the first time. That was quite a shot, Volkov finally said. Elena looked up briefly, then returned to her rifle maintenance. They shouldn't have hit that old man. Ivan never hurt anyone in his life. The Germans will be back, the colonel warned. Probably in much larger numbers. They won't be caught off guard again. Good, Elena replied simply. I'll be ready for them. Volkov studied her face carefully. He had seen many soldiers over the years, and he recognized something in Elena that couldn't be taught or trained. She possessed the rare combination of natural shooting ability, emotional control, and moral conviction that made for an exceptional sniper. More importantly, she had proven she could kill when necessary without falling apart afterward. Elena, he said slowly, I think we need to have a serious conversation about your future. She set down her cleaning supplies and met his gaze directly. What kind of conversation? The kind that might help us win this war. That evening, Colonel Volkov called together his senior officers in the school building that served as their headquarters. The room was lit by oil lamps and filled with cigarette smoke. Maps covered every available wall space, marked with the rapidly changing positions of German and Soviet forces. The news was uniformly bad. The Wehrmacht was advancing faster than anyone had thought possible. Gentlemen, Volkov began, we face a difficult situation. Our regular forces are in full retreat, and we're essentially on our own. We need to find ways to slow the German advance and make them pay for every kilometer of ground they take. Captain Boris Kozlov, a young officer barely older than Elena, raised his hand. Sir, with respect, we have perhaps 30 men with decent weapons. The Germans have tanks, aircraft, and unlimited supplies. What can we possibly accomplish? Volkov smiled grimly. We can make them afraid to leave their fortified positions. We can pick off their officers, their specialists, anyone who makes the mistake of presenting themselves as a target. We can become ghosts in the forest, striking without warning and vanishing before they can respond. You're talking about guerrilla warfare, said Lieutenant Pavel Orlov, an older officer with experience in the Finnish conflict. That requires specialized skills most of our men don't possess. Which is why I want to discuss an unusual proposition with you, Volkov replied. He walked to the window and gazed out at the darkened village. This morning, one of our civilians eliminated a German reconnaissance patrol with a single shot at 250 meters. The shooter then disappeared into the forest so completely that a dozen German soldiers couldn't find so much as a footprint. The officers exchanged glances. Kozlov leaned forward eagerly. One of our men managed that? Which unit was he with? Not one of our men, Volkov said quietly. A young woman from the village. Elena Petrov. The room fell silent. Several officers looked uncomfortable, and Captain Kozlov's enthusiasm visibly deflated. In 1941, the Soviet military was still predominantly male, and the idea of women in combat roles was largely theoretical. Lieutenant Orloff spoke first. Colonel, surely you're not suggesting we arm civilian women and send them into battle against the Wehrmacht. I'm suggesting we recognize exceptional ability wherever we find it, Volkov replied firmly. Elena Petrov is the finest natural marksman I've encountered in 20 years of military service. She's already proven she can kill the enemy and escape detection. Most importantly, she wants to fight. But, sir, Captain Kozlov protested, she's just a village girl. She has no military training, no understanding of tactics or battlefield discipline. Volkov turned to face his officers directly. Neither did most of our best snipers when they started. What they had was natural ability, proper motivation, and good leadership. Elena possesses the first two qualities in abundance. We can provide the third. The debate continued for over an hour. Some officers argued that women belonged in support roles, not as frontline fighters. Others worried about the psychological impact on male soldiers of seeing women killed or wounded in combat. A few questioned whether a civilian could adapt to military discipline and chain of command. Volkov listened patiently to all arguments, then made his decision. Gentlemen, we are fighting for the survival of our homeland. If that homeland is to survive, we need every advantage we can find. Elena Petrov represents such an advantage. I intend to offer her proper training and the opportunity to serve as a sniper. And if she refuses? Asked Lieutenant Orloff. The colonel smiled for the first time that evening. I don't think she will. The next morning, Volkov found Elena in her small garden behind the house, tending to the vegetables that would help feed her family through the coming winter. She looked up as he approached, unsurprised by his visit. Elena had always been perceptive about people's intentions. Colonel, she said simply, continuing to weed around the potato plants. Elena, I have a proposition for you. Volkov sat on the wooden fence surrounding the garden. The war is going badly for us. The Germans are advancing rapidly, and our regular forces are struggling to mount effective resistance. Elena nodded. I've heard the refugees talking. Some say Moscow will fall before winter. That may happen, Volkov admitted. But there are other ways to fight besides pitched battles between armies. Small groups of skilled fighters can cause damage far out of proportion to their numbers. They can make the enemy afraid, force them to divert resources to guard their rear areas, and generally make conquest far more costly than anticipated. She looked up from her weeding, understanding beginning to show in her pale eyes. You want me to fight with you? I want to offer you proper training and equipment to do what you're already doing, but more effectively. You have natural abilities that could make you one of the most dangerous snipers on the Eastern Front. With the right guidance, you could save countless Soviet lives and strike real blows against the fascist invaders. Elena was quiet for a long moment, considering his words. She looked at her small house, where her grandmother was preparing breakfast and her brother was getting ready for another day helping wounded refugees. This peaceful scene seemed impossibly fragile in the context of the spreading war. What would happen to my family? She asked finally. They would be cared for, Volkov assured her. The village council has agreed to provide support for the families of anyone who joins our resistance efforts. Your grandmother and brother would have food, shelter, and protection. Elena stood slowly, brushing dirt from her hands. At that moment, she made the decision that would transform her from an ordinary village girl into one of the most legendary snipers in military history. She had no way of knowing that her name would eventually strike terror into German hearts across hundreds of kilometers of front line, or that enemy soldiers would offer substantial rewards for information leading to her capture. All she knew was that fascist invaders had come to her homeland, threatening everything and everyone she held dear. They had shown their true nature by striking helpless old men and burning innocent villages. Elena Petrov had never backed down from a challenge in her life, and she wasn't about to start now. When do we begin? She asked quietly. Colonel Volkov smiled with satisfaction and perhaps a touch of relief. He had gambled that Elena's character would lead her to accept his offer, but there had been no guarantee. Now, looking at the calm determination in her eyes, he felt confident that his judgment had been correct. Tomorrow morning, he replied. We start with basic military protocols, then move on to advanced marksmanship and field tactics. It won't be easy, Elena. Military discipline is different from civilian life, and combat is different from hunting deer. Elena nodded seriously. I understand, Colonel. I'm ready to learn whatever you need to teach me. As Volkov walked back toward the village center, he reflected on the unusual turn his military career had taken. He had commanded infantry units, artillery batteries, and reconnaissance teams, but he had never trained a female sniper. Elena Petrov would be venturing into largely uncharted territory for the Soviet military, facing not only the challenges of combat, but also the skepticism of male soldiers and officers who questioned women's role in warfare. But Volkov had a strong intuition about people, developed over decades of military service. Elena possessed something rare and valuable, the combination of physical skill, mental toughness, and moral clarity that made for exceptional warriors. Given proper training and support, she could become a weapon of tremendous psychological and tactical value against the German invaders. The colonel also understood that Elena's success or failure would influence how other women were integrated into combat roles as the war progressed. If she proved effective, it would open doors for thousands of other Soviet women who wanted to contribute directly to their country's defense. If she failed, it might set back women's military participation for years. As evening approached, Elena told her grandmother and brother about her decision. The old woman listened in silence, her weathered hands folded in her lap. Mikhail, only 16 but already taller than his sister, struggled to hide his fear and pride. Grandmama, Elena said gently, Colonel Volkov has promised that you and Mikhail will be taken care of. The village will provide what you need. Her grandmother reached out and took Elena's hand in both of hers. Child, I have lived through revolution, civil war, famine, and now this invasion. I have seen many young people march away to fight for causes they believed in. Some came back, many did not. Elena waited, knowing her grandmother had more to say. But I have never seen anyone with your gifts turn away from their duty when their homeland called. Your father would be proud of the woman you have become. Go with my blessing, and may God watch over you. That night, Elena lay awake in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the distant rumble of artillery. Tomorrow would begin a new chapter in her life, one that would take her far from the familiar routines of village existence into a world of danger, violence, and constant uncertainty. She thought about her father's lessons during their hunting trips, his patient instruction in marksmanship and woodcraft. He had taught her to read wind patterns, judge distances, and remain motionless for hours when necessary. Most importantly, he had instilled in her a respect for the power of weapons and the responsibility that came with the ability to take life. A rifle is a tool, Elena, he had often said. Like any tool, it can be used for good or evil. The person holding it makes that choice. Now Elena was about to make that choice on a scale her father could never have imagined. Instead of hunting deer to feed her family, she would be hunting human beings to defend her homeland. The technical skills were similar, but the moral and emotional weight was entirely different. As dawn approached, Elena rose quietly and prepared for her first day of military training. She dressed in her most practical clothing and braided her hair tightly to keep it out of the way. After a simple breakfast with her family, she walked to the school building where Colonel Volkov was waiting. Are you ready, Elena? He asked. She shouldered her father's old hunting rifle and looked directly into the colonel's eyes. Yes, sir. I'm ready to begin. The morning air was crisp and filled with the scent of pine needles as Elena followed Colonel Volkov through the forest path. Her first week of military training had been unlike anything she had experienced. The colonel had been thorough in his instruction, covering everything from basic military protocol to advanced camouflage techniques. But today marked the beginning of her real education as a sniper. Sergeant Viktor Morozov waited for them in a small clearing about 2 kilometers from the village. A veteran of both the Finnish War and the early stages of the current conflict, Morozov had earned a reputation as one of the Red Army's most skilled marksmen before taking shrapnel in his left leg that ended his frontline service. Now he served as Colonel Volkov's specialist instructor for unconventional warfare. Elena's first impression of Morozov was of a man carved from granite. He stood barely taller than herself, but his compact frame radiated the controlled strength of someone accustomed to hardship. His face bore several scars, and his eyes held the distant look common among soldiers who had seen too much combat. So this is our volunteer sniper, Morozov said, circling Elena slowly and examining her from head to toe. She's smaller than I expected. Size can be an advantage for a sniper, Colonel Volkov replied. Easier to find concealment, less conspicuous when moving through enemy territory. Morozov grunted noncommittally. We'll see. Show me your rifle, girl. Elena unslung her father's hunting rifle, a well-maintained Mosin Nagant that had served him faithfully for over 20 years. Morozov examined it carefully, checking the action, inspecting the bore, and testing the trigger pull. Decent weapon, he finally admitted, but not suitable for military sniping. The stock is worn, the barrel has seen better days, and there's no scope mount. He walked to a wooden crate hidden under a canvas tarp and removed another Mosin Nagant, this one equipped with a telescopic sight and a specially selected barrel. This is what you'll be using. It's been accurized by our best armorers and fitted with a 4x scope. With proper maintenance and the right ammunition, it's capable of clean kills out to 600 meters. Elena accepted the rifle reverently, immediately noticing its superior balance and craftsmanship. The scope was a German model, probably captured from an enemy sniper. She raised it to her shoulder and was pleased to find that it fit her perfectly. Before we begin shooting, Morozov announced, we need to discuss the fundamental differences between hunting animals and hunting men. Animals rely on instinct and are predictable in their behavior. Humans think, adapt, and learn from mistakes. A deer that escapes your shot will simply run away. A German soldier who survives your attack will call in artillery strikes on your position. Over the next several hours, Morozov introduced Elena to concepts she had never needed to consider during her hunting expeditions. Ballistics tables for various ammunition types, the effects of temperature and humidity on bullet trajectory, methods for estimating range without optical equipment, and dozens of other technical details that separated professional military snipers from civilian marksmen. But the most important lessons concerned fieldcraft, the art of moving invisibly through hostile territory. Morozov demonstrated how to construct natural blinds that would fool even experienced soldiers, techniques for approaching targets without leaving tracks or other signs, and methods for escaping after taking a shot. The key to survival as a sniper is patience, Morozov explained as they constructed a camouflaged hide in a dense thicket. You may wait hours or even days for the right opportunity. During that time, you cannot move, you cannot make noise, and you cannot leave evidence of your presence. Many good marksmen die because they lack the discipline to wait for perfect conditions. Elena absorbed these lessons eagerly, asking intelligent questions and demonstrating a natural aptitude for the more subtle aspects of snipercraft. Morozov was particularly impressed by her ability to remain motionless for extended periods, a skill honed during years of hunting in the deep forest. After a week of intensive training, Morozov announced that Elena was ready for her first combat mission. Colonel Volkov had received intelligence about a German supply convoy that would be passing through a nearby valley in 2 days. The convoy included several trucks carrying ammunition and fuel for German units advancing toward Petrozavodsk. This will be primarily an observation mission, Volkov explained during the briefing. We need accurate intelligence about enemy movement patterns and vehicle types. If an opportunity presents itself for a high-value target, you are authorized to take the shot, but intelligence gathering is the primary objective. Elena spent the evening before the mission preparing her equipment meticulously. She cleaned her rifle thoroughly, checked and rechecked her scope adjustments, and selected her ammunition carefully. Morozov had taught her to examine each cartridge individually, discarding any with visible defects that might affect accuracy. She also prepared her camouflage and concealment materials. The German convoy would pass through an area of mixed forest and open meadows, requiring her to blend with multiple types of terrain. Elena selected clothing and accessories that would allow her to disappear against pine bark, autumn leaves, and the tall grass of abandoned fields. The night before departing, Elena visited her family one final time. Her grandmother had prepared a small meal of bread, cheese, and preserved vegetables, luxuries in the increasingly difficult wartime conditions. Mikhail tried to maintain a cheerful demeanor, but Elena could see the worry in his eyes. "How long will you be gone?" he asked. Perhaps 2 or 3 days, Elena replied honestly. It depends on what we discover about German movements. Her grandmother pressed a small wooden cross into Elena's hand. Your mother wore this when she was young. It may bring you protection. Elena accepted the gift solemnly, understanding its significance. Her grandmother was not particularly religious, but, in times of great danger, even practical people sought comfort in traditional beliefs. Before dawn, Elena met Sergeant Morozov at the edge of the village. The older sniper carried a pack containing food, water, and emergency medical supplies sufficient for 3 days in the field. Elena's equipment was lighter but included specialized items, camouflage netting, a small folding shovel for constructing firing positions, and field glasses for long-range observation. They moved through the forest like ghosts, following game trails and avoiding any areas where they might encounter German patrols. Morozov had studied the terrain carefully and planned a route that would bring them to an observation position overlooking the valley road by midday. The journey required nearly 6 hours of careful movement through increasingly hostile territory. As they approached the target area, evidence of German presence became more common. Tire tracks in muddy sections of forest roads, discarded food containers bearing German markings, and occasional distant engine sounds all indicated heavy enemy activity. Finally, Morozov led Elena to a rocky outcropping that provided an excellent view of the valley below while offering natural concealment among the boulders and pine trees. They spent over an hour constructing a carefully camouflaged hide, using branches, leaves, and netting to create positions that were virtually invisible from ground level. Now we wait, Morozov whispered, settling into his observation position. Remember, no movement, no noise, no unnecessary actions. We are part of the landscape until the mission is complete. Elena positioned herself comfortably behind her rifle, adjusting the scope, and taking careful note of wind conditions and range estimates to various points along the road. The convoy was expected sometime in the early afternoon, but there was no guarantee it would arrive on schedule or follow the anticipated route. The waiting began. Elena discovered that remaining motionless for hours while maintaining total alertness was far more difficult than any physical challenge she had previously encountered. Every muscle in her body wanted to shift position, every insect bite demanded scratching, and every sound in the forest seemed to require investigation. But Morozov's training held. Elena forced herself to remain statue still, controlling her breathing and heart rate while maintaining constant vigilance. She began to understand why so few soldiers possessed the temperament necessary for successful sniper operations. At approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Elena heard the distant rumble of heavy vehicles approaching from the north. She adjusted her position slightly, bringing her scope to bear on a section of road about 400 meters away where the convoy would be most exposed. The first vehicle to appear was a German motorcycle with sidecar, its crew scanning the surrounding terrain for signs of danger. Elena tracked them through her scope, but made no aggressive moves. Reconnaissance elements were rarely high-value targets, and shooting them would only alert the rest of the convoy to the presence of enemy snipers. The main convoy followed several minutes later. Elena counted 12 vehicles in total, 8 trucks carrying supplies, 2 staff cars with officers, 1 armored car, and a tank bringing up the rear. It was a substantial force, indicating that the Germans were moving significant resources toward the front lines. Through her scope, Elena observed the convoy with professional detachment, noting vehicle types, estimated troop strength, and the location of communication equipment. This intelligence would be valuable for planning future attacks against German supply lines. But, as the convoy passed through the killing zone, Elena noticed something that made her blood run cold. In the back of one of the trucks, she could see civilian prisoners, men, women, and children from captured villages. They were bound with ropes and guarded by German soldiers with rifles. Elena felt a surge of rage that threatened to overwhelm her training. These were not military prisoners who might expect harsh treatment as part of warfare. These were innocent civilians, probably being transported to labor camps or worse destinations. Among them, Elena could see elderly people who reminded her of her grandmother and children no older than her brother Mikhail. She shifted her aim to track one of the German officers in a staff car, a middle-aged man with the insignia of a major. At 400 meters, with perfect visibility and no wind, it would be an easy shot. Elena controlled her breathing and began applying pressure to the trigger. Hold, Morozov whispered urgently. Remember the mission priorities. Elena hesitated, her finger on the trigger. The German major was clearly visible in her scope, unaware that death was only a heartbeat away. But Morozov was right. Their primary mission was intelligence gathering, and taking a shot would compromise their position and possibly lead to the execution of the civilian prisoners in retaliation. With tremendous willpower, Elena eased off the trigger and continued observing. The convoy passed through the valley and disappeared around a bend in the road, taking the helpless prisoners with them. Elena remained in position for another 2 hours, watching for additional German movement, but no further vehicles appeared. As evening approached, Morozov finally signaled that they could abandon their observation post. Elena packed her equipment mechanically, her mind still filled with images of the captured civilians. She had possessed the ability to strike a blow against their captors, but had been forced to restrain herself for tactical reasons. "You did well today," Morozov said quietly as they prepared to return to the village. "I know it was difficult to watch that convoy pass without taking action." Elena looked at him sharply. "How do you know what I was thinking?" The veteran sniper smiled grimly. "Because I have been in similar situations many times. Every sniper faces moments when their personal feelings conflict with mission requirements. Learning to control those emotions is part of becoming an effective soldier." "But those were innocent people," Elena protested. "Children and old people who never harmed anyone." "Yes," Morozov agreed. "And shooting one German officer would not have saved them. It would only have triggered a massive search of this area, possibly leading to the discovery and destruction of our base. Sometimes the greater good requires accepting smaller injustices." Elena understood the logic of his argument, but it did nothing to diminish her anger and frustration. She had joined the fight to protect innocent people from fascist brutality, but her first combat mission had required her to watch helplessly while such brutality continued. The journey back to the village took most of the night. Morozov moved cautiously, aware that their reconnaissance mission might have been detected despite their precautions. German patrols had become increasingly active in the area, and several partisan groups had been discovered and destroyed in recent weeks. They reached the village safely just before dawn. Colonel Volkov was waiting for them in the school building, eager to receive their intelligence report. Elena provided detailed information about the convoy's composition, route, and timing, information that would be transmitted to higher headquarters for use in planning future operations. "Excellent work," Volkov said when Elena finished her briefing. "This intelligence will help us understand German supply patterns and possibly set up more effective ambushes." "Colonel," Elena said hesitantly, "there were civilian prisoners in one of the trucks. Where would they be taking them?" Volkov's expression darkened. "Probably to labor camps in Germany, or to facilities where they will be questioned about partisan activities in their home villages. The Germans have been systematically removing civilians from areas where resistance is active." Elena felt sick. "Isn't there anything we can do to help them?" "Not directly," Volkov admitted. "But every German supply truck we destroy, every officer we eliminate, and every operation we disrupt brings us closer to ending this war and freeing all the prisoners." Over the following days, Elena threw herself into training with renewed intensity. Morozov introduced her to advanced techniques for urban sniping, night operations, and coordination with other partisan units. She learned to construct improvised explosives, operate German radio equipment captured from enemy units, and treat battlefield wounds when medical support was unavailable. But the most important lessons concerned the psychological aspects of warfare. Morozov had fought in enough campaigns to understand that technical skill was only part of what made an effective sniper. Mental toughness, emotional control, and the ability to function under extreme stress were equally important. "Killing is easy," Morozov explained during one of their sessions. "Any fool with a rifle can kill. But killing the right person at the right time for the right reasons, that requires judgment and discipline. You will face situations where the moral choice is not clear, where any action you take will have negative consequences for someone." Elena listened carefully, understanding that Morozov was preparing her for the ethical complexities of irregular warfare. Partisan operations often involve difficult decisions that regular soldiers never had to make. Snipers, operating independently and often without immediate supervision, bore particular responsibility for their choices. How do you live with it? Elena asked. Knowing that people died because of decisions you made? Morozov was quiet for a long moment. By remembering why we fight, he finally said. Every German soldier we kill is one less person shooting at our friends and families. Every supply convoy we destroy means fewer weapons being used against innocent civilians. The moral burden of violence is real, but sometimes violence is necessary to protect what we value most. Elena's second combat mission came 10 days later. Intelligence reports indicated that a German communications post had been established in an abandoned monastery about 15 kilometers from the village. The post was lightly defended but played a crucial role in coordinating German operations across a wide area. Colonel Volkov decided that destroying this facility was worth the risk of a direct attack. Elena would be part of a 3-person team tasked with eliminating the guards and destroying the radio equipment. It would be her first mission involving close combat against alerted enemies. The team consisted of Elena, Sergeant Morozov, and a young partisan named Alexei Volkov, the colonel's nephew who had joined the resistance after his infantry unit was destroyed during the initial German advance. Alexei was barely 18 but had already proven himself in several small engagements against German patrols. They departed the village at midnight, carrying equipment for what was expected to be a 2-day operation. In addition to their personal weapons, they brought explosives for destroying the radio equipment and emergency supplies in case they were forced to remain in hiding for extended periods. The monastery sat on a hill surrounded by open fields, making direct approach dangerous during daylight hours. The Germans had chosen the location precisely because it was difficult for attackers to reach without being observed. However, Morozov had identified a route through a ravine that would allow them to reach the base of the hill undetected. They reached the observation position before dawn and spent the morning studying German defensive arrangements through field glasses. Elena counted 8 guards total, with 2 manning a machine gun position overlooking the main approach road, 2 more patrolling the perimeter, and the remainder presumably inside the monastery building. The key is eliminating the sentries silently, Morozov explained. If they raise an alarm, reinforcements will arrive before we can complete our mission. Elena studied the guard positions carefully. The 2 perimeter sentries followed predictable routes, presenting opportunities for elimination during specific windows when they were isolated from their comrades. The machine gun crew would be more difficult, requiring simultaneous elimination to prevent either man from raising an alarm. I can take both machine gunners, Elena said confidently. From this position, it's less than 200 meters, and I have a clear field of fire. Morozov nodded approvingly. Alexei and I will handle the roving sentries. Once all exterior guards are eliminated, we move quickly to the building and deal with anyone inside. They waited until late afternoon, when long shadows would provide additional concealment for their approach. Elena positioned herself carefully, using natural terrain features to create a stable shooting platform. Through her scope, she could see both German machine gunners clearly, one manning the weapon while the other served as spotter and ammunition bearer. The plan called for simultaneous action by all team members. At Morozov's signal, Elena would engage the machine gun position while he and Alexei eliminated the sentries. Timing was critical. Any delay would allow survivors to alert the garrison inside the monastery. Morozov raised his hand, then dropped it sharply. Elena squeezed her trigger, sending a bullet through the machine gunner's head. She worked the bolt rapidly and fired again, killing the spotter before he could react to his comrade's death. Both Germans collapsed silently over their weapon. Simultaneously, Morozov and Alexei struck the roving sentries with knives, eliminating them without noise that might alert the interior garrison. The first phase of the attack had been completed perfectly. All exterior guards were dead, and no alarm had been raised. Elena slung her rifle and moved quickly down the hillside to join her companions. The second phase would require close-quarters fighting inside the monastery building, where her rifle would be less useful than the submachine gun she carried as a secondary weapon. The monastery's main entrance was a heavy wooden door that stood slightly ajar. Morozov approached cautiously and peered inside, then signaled that he could see at least 2 Germans working at radio equipment in what had once been the building's chapel. "Flash grenades first," he whispered. "Then we go in fast and finish anyone left standing." Alexei produced 2 grenades from his pack and pulled the pins. On Morozov's signal, he rolled them through the doorway into the chapel. The explosions that followed were deafening in the confined space, accompanied by shouts of alarm and confusion from inside. Elena followed Morozov through the doorway, her submachine gun ready. The chapel was filled with smoke and debris from the grenade explosions. 3 Germans lay motionless near the radio equipment, while a 4th was crawling toward a rifle propped against the wall. Elena shot the crawling German before he could reach his weapon. Morozov moved systematically through the chapel, checking each body to ensure all enemy personnel were dead. Alexei began placing demolition charges on the radio equipment and communication cables. 2 minutes, Alexei announced, referring to the timer on his explosives. Then, this whole facility becomes useless scrap metal. Elena moved to the chapel windows and scanned the surrounding countryside for signs of German reinforcements. The sound of the grenade explosions might have been heard by other enemy units in the area, making rapid withdrawal essential. "Clear to the south and east," she reported. "I can see a dust cloud to the north that might be vehicles, but they're still several kilometers away." Morozov checked his watch. "Time to go?" Everyone out and moving toward the extraction point. They left the monastery at a dead run, racing down the hillside toward the ravine that would provide concealment during their withdrawal. Behind them, Alexei's charges detonated in a series of sharp explosions that sent smoke and debris high into the evening sky. The withdrawal proved more difficult than anticipated. German reinforcements had indeed been dispatched to investigate the attack, and enemy search parties were soon combing the area around the monastery. Elena and her companions were forced to hide in the ravine for over 6 hours while German soldiers passed within meters of their position. During this tense period, Elena gained new appreciation for the mental demands of irregular warfare. The constant threat of discovery, combined with the need for absolute silence and stillness, created a stress unlike anything she had experienced during conventional combat training. But her hunting background once again proved invaluable. Elena's ability to remain motionless for extended periods allowed her to outlast the German searches without compromising the team's position. By dawn, the enemy forces had moved on to search other areas, allowing Elena's team to complete their withdrawal safely. The attack on the monastery was considered a complete success. German communications in the region were disrupted for several days, while replacement equipment was brought forward. More importantly, the bold attack convinced German commanders that partisan activity in the area was increasing, forcing them to divert troops from frontline duties to guard supply lines and installations. Colonel Volkov was particularly pleased with Elena's performance during the mission. Her precision shooting had eliminated the most dangerous threats silently, and her discipline during the long withdrawal had helped the team avoid capture or casualties. "You're beginning to think like a soldier," Volkov told her during the post-mission debriefing. "Not just a marksman, but a tactical asset who can contribute to complex operations." Elena accepted the praise modestly, but privately she felt a growing confidence in her abilities. The successful completion of 2 combat missions had proven that her skills could be effective against experienced enemy soldiers, not just surprise sentries or isolated targets. But she also understood that success in irregular warfare required constant adaptation and learning. The Germans would undoubtedly adjust their defensive measures in response to the monastery attack, making future operations more dangerous and complex. As autumn deepened and the first snow began to fall, Elena prepared for what promised to be a long, bitter winter of warfare against an increasingly desperate and brutal enemy. Winter arrived with brutal suddenness in December 1941, bringing temperatures that dropped to -30 degrees Celsius and snow drifts that made movement through the forest treacherous even for experienced woodsmen. For Elena, the harsh conditions presented both challenges and opportunities that would define her evolution from village marksman to legendary sniper. The German advance had stalled as supply lines stretched thin, and Wehrmacht units struggled to adapt to the savage Russian winter. Colonel Volkov's intelligence networks reported that enemy morale was declining rapidly as soldiers accustomed to temperate European climates faced conditions that seemed designed to kill unwary travelers. Elena discovered that winter warfare demanded entirely new skills and equipment. Her normal camouflage was useless against snow-covered terrain, requiring her to develop techniques for blending with the white landscape. Sergeant Morozov provided her with a white canvas oversuit and taught her to construct snow caves that could provide shelter for days while remaining virtually invisible to aerial observation. More challenging was learning to compensate for the effects of extreme cold on both her equipment and her own body. Metal components became brittle and unreliable, lubricants thickened to useless consistency, and optical equipment fogged unpredictably. Elena spent hours practicing with frozen fingers until she could operate her rifle smoothly, even when she couldn't feel her hands. The cold is your enemy and your ally, Morozov explained during one of their training sessions in the frozen forest. It will slow you down, numb your senses, and make every action more difficult. But it affects the Germans even more severely because they're not accustomed to these conditions. Elena's first winter mission came in mid-December when intelligence reports indicated that a senior German officer would be visiting forward positions to assess winter readiness of his units. Major General Klaus Weber commanded an entire division and had earned a reputation for particular cruelty towards civilian populations in occupied territories. The general's inspection tour would bring him to a forward observation post located in an abandoned farmhouse about 12 kilometers from Elena's base. Intelligence suggested he would spend several hours at the location, examining defensive preparations and meeting with subordinate commanders. This is exactly the type of high-value target that justifies the risks of winter operations, Colonel Volkov explained during the mission briefing. Weber has been responsible for the execution of hundreds of civilians and the deportation of thousands more to labor camps. Eliminating him would disrupt German operations and potentially save many innocent lives. Elena studied the target area carefully using maps and intelligence photographs. The farmhouse sat in a shallow valley surrounded by open fields, providing excellent fields of fire but limited concealment for a sniper. The nearest cover that would allow a reasonable shooting position was a tree line approximately 600 meters from the target building. 600 meters in winter conditions, Morozov mused when Elena presented her tactical assessment. That's at the extreme range for reliable accuracy, especially with wind and temperature factors. I can make the shot, Elena said confidently. The conditions will be difficult, but I've been practicing at long range every day for weeks. Morozov studied her carefully. Elena's confidence had grown substantially over the past months, but he remained concerned about the psychological pressure of attempting such a difficult shot under combat conditions. Missing would not only waste a valuable opportunity, but might also damage Elena's confidence for future missions. There's another factor to consider, Volkov added. Weber travels with a substantial security detail. After the shot, you'll need to evade immediate pursuit by soldiers who know exactly where the shot came from. Elena nodded soberly. I've planned an escape route through the forest to the north. There's a stream bed that will provide concealment for the first kilometer, then dense woods that should break up any pursuit. The mission was scheduled for December 18th, when weather forecasts predicted clear skies and light winds, optimal conditions for long-range shooting. Elena would travel alone, as the presence of additional personnel would increase the risk of detection without providing significant tactical advantage. She departed the village before dawn, carrying equipment carefully selected for the extreme conditions. Her white camouflage suit would make her nearly invisible against the snow-covered landscape, while specially treated ammunition would perform reliably despite the cold temperatures. The journey to the target area required 8 hours of careful movement through hostile territory. Elena traveled on improvised snowshoes that distributed her weight and prevented her from sinking into the deep drifts that covered most of the landscape. Several times she was forced to hide as German patrols passed nearby, but her white camouflage proved effective in concealing her presence. Elena reached her planned shooting position in the tree line during the early afternoon. The farmhouse was clearly visible across the open fields, approximately 600 20 meters away according to her range-finding calculations. She spent over an hour constructing a carefully concealed hide using snow and fallen branches, creating a position that would be invisible even to observers with binoculars. The waiting began at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Intelligence suggested Weber would arrive sometime between 4 and 6 p.m., but there was no guarantee the schedule would be maintained given the challenging winter conditions. Elena settled into her position and began the mental discipline necessary for extended observation. Winter sniping required different techniques than summer operations. The extreme cold quickly numbed exposed skin and made it difficult to maintain the fine motor control necessary for precision shooting. Elena had learned to exercise her fingers regularly inside her mittens and to warm her rifle's action with body heat to prevent mechanical failures. At approximately 4:30, Elena observed increased activity around the farmhouse. Several staff cars arrived, disgorging German officers who quickly moved inside to escape the bitter wind. Through her scope, Elena could see guards taking positions around the building's perimeter, suggesting that an important visitor had indeed arrived. 20 minutes later, a larger convoy approached the farmhouse from the south. Elena counted 3 vehicles, 2 staff cars, and an armored personnel carrier. The convoy's arrival prompted a flurry of saluting and formal greetings among the German officers outside the building. Through her telescopic sight, Elena observed a tall, heavy-set German officer emerging from the lead staff car. His uniform bore the distinctive insignia of a major general, and his bearing suggested the confidence of someone accustomed to command authority. Elena felt reasonably certain this was Weber, though positive identification was difficult at such range. The German general spent several minutes inspecting the defensive positions around the farmhouse, accompanied by subordinate officers who pointed out various features of their fortifications. Elena tracked him through her scope, noting his movement patterns and trying to predict when he might present the best target. Winter shooting presented unique ballistic challenges that Elena had trained extensively to master. Cold air was denser than warm air, affecting bullet trajectory in subtle but important ways. Wind patterns were also different in winter, with temperature variations creating air currents that could deflect a bullet unpredictably. Elena controlled her breathing and began calculating the precise adjustments necessary for the shot. Range, 620 meters. Wind, light, but variable from the northwest. Temperature, -28 degrees Celsius. Elevation angle, slightly downward from her position to the target. The German general paused near a wooden fence about 50 meters from the farmhouse, examining what appeared to be defensive wire obstacles. For nearly 30 seconds, he remained stationary while pointing out features to his subordinates. Elena recognized this as the optimal shooting opportunity. She adjusted her scope settings for the calculated range and environmental conditions, settled into a stable shooting position, and began applying pressure to her trigger. Through the crosshairs, the German general's head and shoulders were clearly visible against the white backdrop of snow-covered ground. Elena's finger tightened on the trigger as she completed her breathing cycle and reached the natural pause between heartbeats. At that precise moment, the general stepped sideways behind one of his subordinates, presenting only a partial target that would make a clean kill unlikely. Elena relaxed her trigger finger and waited for another opportunity. Patience was crucial for long-range shooting, especially under difficult conditions. A hasty shot that only wounded the target would waste the mission and potentially endanger future operations. For another 10 minutes, Elena tracked the German general through her scope as he completed his inspection of the defensive positions. Several times he presented partial targets, but never with the clear field of fire necessary for a confident shot at such extreme range. Finally, as the general prepared to return to his staff car, he paused to examine a map that one of his subordinates had spread across the hood of the vehicle. For nearly a minute, he remained bent over the map, while his companions pointed out various features of the local terrain. Elena seized the opportunity. She reacquired her target through the scope, made final adjustments for wind and temperature, and began applying steady pressure to her trigger. The German general's head was clearly centered in her crosshairs, motionless as he studied the tactical situation. The rifle bucked against Elena's shoulder with a sharp crack that echoed across the frozen landscape. Through her scope, she saw the German general collapse instantly, a spreading pool of red blood stark against the white snow around his body. For a moment, the other German officers stood frozen in shock, unable to comprehend what had happened. Then, chaos erupted as they realized they were under attack by an unseen enemy. Officers shouted commands, soldiers ran for defensive positions, and several men began scanning the surrounding terrain with binoculars. Elena was already moving. She had trained extensively in rapid withdrawal techniques, knowing that remaining in a shooting position after taking a shot was usually fatal. She abandoned her carefully constructed hide and began moving through the forest at maximum speed, using terrain features to break visual contact with any pursuers. Behind her, she could hear German voices shouting orders and the sound of vehicles starting as the enemy organized pursuit operations. Elena had perhaps a 10-minute head start before German soldiers would reach the tree line where she had been concealed. The escape route Elena had planned proved its worth as she moved rapidly through dense forest where vehicles couldn't follow. The frozen stream bed provided concealment from aerial observation while allowing her to make good time despite the challenging conditions. After 2 hours of hard travel, Elena reached a predetermined rally point where Sergeant Morozov was waiting with a horse-drawn sled. The veteran sniper took one look at her expression and nodded approvingly. "Clean kill?" he asked. "Yes," Elena replied simply. "Weber is dead." The return journey to the village required most of the night, as they took an indirect route designed to confuse any German forces that might still be pursuing. Elena used the time to reflect on her longest and most challenging shot to date. The technical aspects had gone perfectly, but she found herself thinking more about the broader implications of her success. Major General Weber had been responsible for countless atrocities against civilian populations. His death would undoubtedly save lives and possibly disrupt German operations across a wide area. But Elena also understood that the Germans would likely retaliate against local villages suspected of harboring snipers. "You look troubled," Morozov observed as their sled moved silently through the forest. "I'm thinking about consequences," Elena replied. "What will the Germans do in response to Weber's death?" Morozov considered her question carefully. "They will probably implement harsh security measures and may execute hostages in retaliation. But they were already committing atrocities against civilians. At least now they will be doing so without one of their most effective commanders." Elena understood the logic, but it didn't entirely resolve her moral concerns. Irregular warfare inevitably involved civilian populations in ways that conventional combat did not. Every partisan action potentially endangered innocent people who had no choice about their involvement. News of Weber's death spread rapidly through both German and Soviet intelligence networks. German radio broadcasts announced that the general had been killed by communist terrorists and promised severe retribution against anyone providing support to partisan forces. Soviet broadcasts celebrated the elimination of a fascist war criminal and praised the skill of the unknown sniper responsible. Colonel Volkov was particularly pleased with the successful mission. Weber's death had already begun causing disruption in German command structures as subordinate officers argued over succession and responsibility for various operations. This demonstrates the potential impact of well-planned sniper operations, Volkov explained to Elena during their post-mission conference. One precisely placed bullet has achieved effects that would require an entire regiment to accomplish through conventional attacks. Elena's reputation began growing beyond her immediate area of operations. German intelligence services started distributing warnings about an exceptionally skilled sniper operating in the Karelia region. They offered rewards for information leading to the capture of what they termed the ghost of the forest. But success also brought increased attention from German counter-sniper units. Elena learned that enemy forces were deploying their own marksmen specifically tasked with hunting partisan snipers. The war was becoming increasingly personal and deadly. Winter also brought changes to Elena's personal situation. Her brother Mikhail, now 17 and tall for his age, requested permission to join the partisan forces. Elena was torn between pride in his courage and fear for his safety. "You're too young," she told him during one of her brief visits home. "The fighting will still be going on when you're older and better prepared." Mikhail's jaw set stubbornly. "I'm the same age many of the partisans were when they started fighting. And I'm tired of sitting in the village while my sister risks her life to defend our homeland. Elena discussed the situation with Colonel Volkov, who was sympathetic but practical. Young men are valuable for many types of operations, he acknowledged. But they're also impulsive and inexperienced. If Mikhail joins us, he'll need extensive training before he can participate in combat missions. Eventually, Elena agreed to let her brother begin basic partisan training, with the understanding that he would not be assigned to dangerous missions until he demonstrated sufficient maturity and skill. Mikhail threw himself into the training program with enthusiasm, eager to prove himself worthy of fighting alongside his legendary sister. As 1942 approached, Elena had established herself as one of the most effective snipers operating behind German lines. Her confirmed kills included over 30 enemy soldiers, several officers, and at least one general. German forces in her area of operations had become increasingly cautious, often refusing to expose themselves unnecessarily for fear of the invisible marksman. But Elena knew that her greatest challenges lay ahead. German counterintelligence was becoming more sophisticated, and enemy snipers were being specifically deployed to hunt her. The war was entering a new phase where personal survival would require ever greater skill and cunning. Winter had also taught Elena important lessons about the psychological demands of prolonged combat. The isolation of sniper operations, combined with the moral complexity of irregular warfare, created mental stresses that could be as dangerous as enemy bullets. Elena had learned to manage these pressures, but she understood that many snipers eventually succumbed to what military doctors euphemistically called combat fatigue. As she cleaned her rifle on New Year's Eve 1941, Elena reflected on how much her life had changed since the morning when Colonel Volkov had first proposed that she become a military sniper. The village girl who had reluctantly agreed to fight for her homeland had evolved into a weapon of war whose reputation struck fear into enemy forces across hundreds of square kilometers. But Elena also remained connected to her original motivations. She fought not for glory or revenge, but to protect innocent people from fascist oppression. Every German officer she killed was one fewer person giving orders to execute civilians or deport families to labor camps. The coming year would test Elena's skills, courage, and moral convictions in ways she could not yet imagine. German forces would launch new offensives designed to crush Soviet resistance, while Soviet partisans would mount increasingly bold operations behind enemy lines. Elena had become a master of her deadly craft, but mastery only meant that greater challenges and responsibilities lay ahead. The silent woman who stepped up when her general called for volunteers had found her calling in the frozen forests of wartime Russia. Spring of 1942 brought both hope and intensified danger to Elena's war-torn homeland. As the snow melted and revealed the devastation of winter fighting, German forces prepared for what many believed would be their final push to crush Soviet resistance. For Elena, who had spent the harsh winter months perfecting her deadly skills, the changing season would mark her transformation from respected sniper to legendary figure whose name would be whispered in fear across the entire Eastern Front. The winter had claimed many lives on both sides, but it had also forged Elena into something approaching a perfect weapon. Her confirmed kill count had risen to over 60 enemy soldiers, including 5 officers of field grade or higher. German intelligence had begun referring to her specifically as Der Geist, the ghost, and had placed a bounty of 10,000 Reichsmarks on her head, dead or alive. Colonel Volkov had established new partisan cells throughout the region, and Elena found herself increasingly involved in training other snipers. Her unique combination of natural talent, combat experience, and teaching ability made her invaluable for passing on the skills that had made her so effective. Remember, Elena told a group of young partisans during one training session, shooting is only half of being a sniper. The other half is staying alive long enough to shoot again. The moment you fire, your position is compromised. Your escape route is more important than your shooting position. Among her students was her brother Mikhail, now 18, and possessed of many of the same natural talents that had made Elena exceptional. He had inherited their father's steady hands and keen eyesight, combined with Elena's patience and analytical mind. But Elena remained concerned about his emotional readiness for the psychological demands of sniper warfare. The spring offensive began in early May when German forces launched Operation Blue, designed to capture the oil fields of the Caucasus and cut Soviet supply lines along the Volga River. As part of this broader campaign, German units in Elena's area received orders to eliminate partisan resistance that had become increasingly troublesome to their supply operations. Elena's first major engagement of the spring came when German forces surrounded the village that had served as Colonel Volkov's headquarters. Intelligence reports suggested that enemy commanders had finally identified the location of the partisan command center and were determined to destroy it completely. "We have perhaps 6 hours before they complete their encirclement," Volkov announced during an emergency briefing. "Most of the civilian population has already been evacuated, but we need to hold long enough for our intelligence archives and communication equipment to be moved to safety." Elena studied the tactical situation carefully. German forces were approaching from 3 directions, using a classic pincer movement that would trap any defenders who waited too long to withdraw. However, the enemy advance would necessarily expose their flanks to sniper fire during the critical phase of the encirclement. "I can slow their advance from the north," Elena volunteered. "There's good concealment in the forest, and they'll have to cross several open areas where I can engage their officers and specialists." "Too dangerous," Volkov replied immediately. "If you're cut off, there's no possibility of rescue or extraction." Elena met his gaze directly. "Colonel, with respect, this is what snipers do. We accept risk to provide tactical advantage for our units. I can buy you the time you need." After considerable debate, Volkov agreed to Elena's proposal, but only on condition that Mikhail and 2 other experienced partisans would provide security and coordinate her withdrawal when the mission was complete. Elena positioned herself in a grove of birch trees that overlooked the main approach road from the north. German forces would be forced to use this route to bring their heavy weapons and vehicles into position for the final assault. From her concealed position, she could engage targets at ranges from 200 to 600 meters. The German advance began at dawn with a reconnaissance force of motorcycles and armored cars. Elena allowed these vehicles to pass without engaging, knowing that alerting the enemy to her presence too early would reduce her effectiveness against the main force following behind. An hour later, the primary German column appeared on the road below. Elena counted over 200 soldiers, supported by several tanks and self-propelled guns. It was a formidable force, more than sufficient to overwhelm the remaining partisan defenders in the village. But Elena also observed that the German formation followed predictable patterns that offered opportunities for a skilled sniper. Officers traveled in easily identified vehicles, specialists operated distinctive equipment, and the entire column was constrained by the narrow road that limited their ability to disperse when attacked. Elena's first target was a German captain who was standing in the turret of a tank, directing the advance with hand signals. At 300 meters, through clear morning air, it was a routine shot for someone of Elena's skill level. Her bullet struck the officer in the chest, killing him instantly and causing immediate confusion among the tank crew. Her second shot targeted a communications specialist operating a radio from the back of a truck. Elena had learned that disrupting enemy communications was often more valuable than simply killing random soldiers. Without radio contact, the German column would struggle to coordinate with other elements of the encircling force. The effect of Elena's opening shots was dramatic. The entire German column immediately halted and began taking defensive positions, assuming they had encountered a significant partisan ambush. Officers shouted orders while soldiers scanned the surrounding forest for targets that remained invisible. Elena had trained extensively in shooting and movement, understanding that remaining in one position after engaging enemy forces was usually fatal. She fired 2 more shots from her initial position, killing a sergeant who was attempting to organize the defensive response, then moved rapidly to a second position she had prepared 200 meters away. From her new location, Elena could engage the German column from a different angle, maintaining the illusion that multiple snipers were operating in the area. She killed 3 more German soldiers in quick succession, including another officer who was attempting to coordinate a search of the forest. The German response was swift and massive. Artillery shells began falling in the area where Elena had fired her first shots, followed by sustained machine gun fire that stripped leaves and bark from dozens of trees. But Elena was already gone, moving to her third prepared position while the Germans attacked empty forest. For over 2 hours, Elena conducted a deadly game of cat and mouse with the German force. She would appear at one location long enough to kill 1 or 2 enemy soldiers, then vanish before the inevitable artillery response could locate her position. The psychological effect on German morale was as important as the physical casualties she inflicted. By mid-morning, the German column had advanced less than 2 kilometers despite overwhelming superiority in numbers and equipment. Their officers were becoming increasingly frustrated with their inability to locate and eliminate the sniper who was systematically picking off their key personnel. Elena's last shot of the engagement targeted the German major commanding the entire operation. She had observed him through her scope for nearly 30 minutes, noting his movement patterns and waiting for the optimal opportunity. When he finally emerged from his command vehicle to personally assess the tactical situation, Elena was ready. The shot was taken at extreme range, nearly 700 meters, through challenging conditions that included variable wind and partially obscured visibility. But Elena's months of training and combat experience had prepared her for exactly such situations. Her bullet struck the German major in the head, killing him instantly and effectively decapitating the enemy command structure. With their commanding officer dead and their advance stalled by an apparently invisible enemy, German morale finally collapsed. The surviving officers ordered a tactical withdrawal, abandoning their attempt to capture the village before reinforcements could arrive. Elena used the confusion of the German retreat to make her own withdrawal, moving rapidly through predetermined escape routes to reach the rally point where Mikhail and the other partisans were waiting. The mission had been a complete success. Colonel Volkov had gained the time necessary to evacuate his headquarters and preserve the intelligence network that was crucial to partisan operations. But Elena's success came at a personal cost. During the engagement, she had been forced to kill 11 German soldiers, including several who appeared to be barely older than her brother. The psychological burden of taking so many lives in a single day weighed heavily on her, despite her understanding of the tactical necessity. "You look troubled, sister," Mikhail observed as they made their way back to the new partisan base. Elena was quiet for a long moment. "Each person I kill had a family somewhere, parents, perhaps a wife, and children. They joined the army for reasons they believed were correct, just as we fight for our homeland." Mikhail frowned. "But they're invaders. They came here to conquer us, to enslave or kill our people." "Yes," Elena agreed. "And that's why they must be stopped. But taking a life should never become easy or routine. The moment we stop feeling the weight of what we do, we risk becoming no better than those we fight against." This conversation marked an important evolution in Elena's understanding of her role as a sniper. She had always been motivated by the desire to protect innocent people from fascist aggression, but her growing experience with combat had taught her that warfare inevitably involved moral complexity that simple patriotic slogans couldn't resolve. Summer brought new challenges as German forces adapted their tactics to account for the increasing effectiveness of Soviet partisans. Enemy units began traveling with dedicated counter-sniper teams equipped with specialized optical equipment and trained specifically to locate and eliminate hidden marksmen. Elena's first encounter with one of these German sniper hunters occurred in late June, when she was observing enemy supply convoys from a concealed position overlooking a major transportation route. She had been in position for over 3 hours, waiting for a high-value target to present itself, when she noticed unusual activity among the German guards. Instead of maintaining their normal patrol patterns, several soldiers were moving systematically through the area with binoculars and telescopic sights, clearly searching for something specific. Elena realized that her presence had somehow been detected, despite her careful attention to camouflage and concealment. As she prepared to withdraw from her position, Elena caught a glimpse of sunlight reflecting off glass in a tree line about 400 meters away. Experience told her that this was likely the scope of an enemy sniper who was attempting to locate her exact position. Elena found herself in a deadly duel with an opponent whose skills were comparable to her own. She could not simply withdraw without exposing herself to observation and possible elimination. But remaining in her current position would eventually allow the German sniper to pinpoint her location and take a shot. Using techniques Sergeant Morozov had taught her months earlier, Elena began a careful process of counter-sniping. She used her scope to systematically examine the area where she had observed the reflection, looking for any sign of the enemy marksman's position. After 20 minutes of patient observation, Elena detected the barrel of a rifle protruding slightly from behind a fallen log. The German sniper had chosen his position well, but a small error in concealment had given away his location. Elena adjusted her scope for the range and began planning her shot. The duel was decided by patience and precision. Elena waited for nearly an hour, maintaining perfect concealment while watching for the German sniper to make a mistake. When he finally moved slightly to adjust his position, Elena was ready. Her shot struck him center mass, eliminating the threat and allowing her to complete her original mission. This engagement marked the beginning of a new phase in Elena's war. German forces were no longer content to simply avoid areas where she might be operating. They were actively hunting her, using their best snipers and most sophisticated equipment in an effort to eliminate what had become a serious tactical problem. Elena adapted by becoming even more careful and systematic in her operations. She began working with larger partisan units that could provide security and intelligence support, allowing her to focus on the technical aspects of long-range shooting while others handled reconnaissance and route planning. Her brother Mikhail proved particularly valuable as a spotter and security provider. His natural talents, combined with intensive training from Elena and Sergeant Morozov, had made him an effective partisan in his own right. More importantly, the trust and communication between the siblings allowed them to operate as a highly effective team. By autumn 1942, Elena had become a figure of almost mythical reputation among both Soviet partisans and German forces. Her confirmed kill count exceeded 100 enemy soldiers, including 12 officers of major or higher rank. German radio intercepts revealed that some enemy units refused to operate in areas where she was known to be active. But Elena's greatest contribution may have been her role in training the next generation of Soviet snipers. Her methods and techniques were being copied throughout the partisan movement, multiplying her effectiveness far beyond what any individual sniper could accomplish alone. Colonel Volkov, now commanding a much larger partisan organization, frequently called upon Elena to evaluate potential sniper candidates and provide advanced training for those who showed promise. Her reputation attracted volunteers from across the region, including several women who had been inspired by her example. "You've become more than a sniper," Volkov told Elena during one of their strategic planning meetings. "You've become a symbol of what dedicated individuals can accomplish against overwhelming odds." Elena accepted the compliment, but remained focused on practical considerations. "Symbols are less useful than skilled marksmen," she replied. "Every partisan we train properly is worth a dozen inspiring stories." The war entered its final phase in 1943 as Soviet forces began pushing German invaders back toward their pre-war borders. Elena's role evolved from pure combat operations to intelligence gathering and training duties, though she continued to accept high-priority elimination missions when targets of exceptional value presented themselves. Her last major combat engagement occurred in September 1943 when German forces attempted a final offensive designed to recapture territory they had lost during the summer fighting. Elena was assigned to eliminate the German colonel commanding the attack, a veteran officer whose tactical skills had made him particularly dangerous to partisan operations. The mission required Elena to penetrate deep into German-held territory and operate without support for several days while waiting for the target to present himself. It was perhaps the most challenging assignment of her career, requiring all the skills she had developed over 2 years of combat. Elena succeeded in eliminating the German colonel with a single shot at 800 meters, the longest confirmed kill of her career. But the mission also marked her decision to transition from active combat to full-time training and planning duties. "I've been lucky for 2 years," she explained to Colonel Volkov. "But luck eventually runs out, and I can contribute more by training others than by continuing to take personal risks." Volkov accepted her decision reluctantly, understanding that Elena's combat experience and teaching abilities were indeed invaluable for preparing the next generation of partisan fighters. Elena spent the final years of the war developing training programs and tactical doctrine for Soviet sniper operations. Her methods influenced military doctrine for decades afterward, and many of her students went on to become legendary snipers in their own right. When the war ended in May 1945, Elena returned to her village to find a community that had been transformed by years of conflict and occupation. Many familiar faces were gone, but new families had arrived to rebuild what the war had destroyed. Elena married Mikhail's best friend, a partisan veteran who had fought alongside them during the worst years of the conflict. She raised 3 children and worked as a teacher, passing on to a new generation the values and skills that had sustained her through the darkest period in her nation's history. But Elena never forgot the lessons she had learned during her time as a sniper. The importance of patience, precision, and moral clarity remained central to her character long after she had hung up her rifle for the last time. Years later, when military historians interviewed Elena about her wartime experiences, she always emphasized the same theme: I was not a